I know it sounds ridiculous when I say it out loud, but the very first time I felt the weight of what I'd done was in the silence after my words. The moment was so small and ordinary. Maybe I was a little too tipsy. Maybe I was just in a sarcastic mood. And in this quiet space, where no one sees us together anymore, I finally understand what he meant by not wanting to force himself where he isn't wanted. The realization is as painful as it is revealing. We truly only value something when we're on the verge of losing it forever. That's the final truth I'm left with, and it lingers like a bruise on my soul, leaving me uncertain if I'll ever fully heal. It offers lessons, often delivered too late and at a devastating cost. So I live with the uncertainty, the regret, and the faintest glimmer of hope that maybe we'll find each other again someday, and that if we do, I'll be a better person than the one who threw him away. For now, all I can do is accept that I'm the reason he slipped through my fingers, and that the words I spoke carelessly ended up shaping my entire fate. I'm left with that lingering question, the one that keeps me up at night. Will he ever really see me again? Because without his gaze, I feel invisible, as though the parts of me that were good or loving have evaporated in the wake of my careless words. And that's how it ends. At least for now, with me staring into a future that feels so empty without him, knowing that if I had the chance to take back that one moment, I'd do it in a heartbeat. But life doesn't offer simple do-overs. I keep reflecting on all those little moments I dismissed. His silly jokes, his loud laughter, his unfiltered excitement about small pleasures in life. And it hits me that those were exactly the things that made him the man I first fell in love with. Now, I'd give anything to hear one of his bad puns just to feel that warmth in the room again. But that's my cross to bear. I said what I said. He heard it, internalized it, and changed accordingly. And now I'm stuck in this purgatory of my own making, uncertain if I can ever repair the bridge I so carelessly set fire to. Maybe he'll come around. Maybe he'll realize I'm sincere when I tell him I've learned from my mistake. Or maybe the damage runs too deep, and he's already moved on to a life where he doesn't have to feel second class in the eyes of the person who was supposed to love him most. And I can't blame him. In the stillness, I question whether I have the strength to change, really change, and become someone who can love without shame or insecurity. I want to pick up the phone, beg him to come back, promise him everything will be different. But promises are just words, and I've proven words can inflict damage that takes a lifetime to repair. Sometimes I think about reaching out to him anyway. Then I hesitate, wondering if it's just the loneliness talking. I still catch myself waiting for the sound of his key in the lock, the way he'd call out my name from the front door. But the house remained silent, a silent echo of the statement I made. I was embarrassed to be seen with him. Well, no one's seeing me with him now. And in that sense, he's made sure my wish came true more thoroughly than I ever wanted. If there's any consolation, it's that he doesn't seem vindictive or spiteful. He simply decided he won't be where he isn't fully appreciated. And maybe that was the point. My entire world had shifted because of a single remark, an honest admission that was laced with cruelty. Part of me wondered if I'd ever be able to forgive myself, and if he could ever truly forgive me. But for now, all I had were questions, regrets, and the memory of a love I'd taken for granted until it slipped right through my fingers. I sit here now, in the quiet aftermath, grappling with what's left of us. Days turned into weeks, and though we texted sporadically about practical matters, bills, the lease, mundane stuff, there was no warmth in those messages. It was like talking to an old colleague, rather than the man I'd once planned a life with. Slowly, the reality of my situation settled in. I had gotten what I asked for. I wouldn't be seen with him anymore. And yet the cost was unimaginable, and the path forward was so unclear. Even if he came back, we weren't the same people we were before. That night, I wandered around the house, turning off lights, feeling the echoes of his presence in every corner. The room seemed darker, colder without him. I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror, the person who had belittled him just to feel better about herself, the person who had cared too much about appearances and not enough about the person who loved her. And I wondered if I'd ever be able to undo the damage I'd caused. I stood there, tears sliding down my cheeks, realizing this was the moment that I had claimed I wanted. I didn't have to be seen with him anymore. No one would see me beside him. No one would judge me for his quirks, his awkwardness, his overenthusiasm about trivial things. He was gone, and I was free. Except I had never felt so lonely, so shackled by my own choices, in my entire life. I couldn't because a small part of me suspected he was right. Instead, I just nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat, and stepped aside so he could leave. He paused in the hallway, looking at me with an almost sorrowful tenderness, as if he were memorizing the lines of my face. "I hope you find what you're looking for," he said softly. Then the door closed behind him. "I need time to think about what I want. And you need to decide if you really want me back in your life, or if you just don't want to be alone." That cut deeper than anything else he could have said, because it forced me to confront my biggest fear, that maybe my attempts to reconcile weren't out of genuine love, but out of the terror of losing someone who had always been my safety net. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him how wrong he was, but I couldn't. My breath caught in my throat. Where are you going?" I asked, standing in the doorway, watching him zip up the bag. He turned, his expression regretful. "I'm going to stay at a friend's place for a while," he said. "We both need space to figure this out." My eyes started to tear up. "But we can figure it out here, can't we?" The words tumbled out in a shaky whisper, betraying just how terrified I was of him walking out the door. "I think we need a break," he said gently, because now the work began, fixing what I'd broken. And for the first time, I wasn't sure I was strong enough to do it. The final realization of how broken things truly were came not from another fight, but from a simple, heartbreaking gesture. A few days after our brief conversation, I woke up to find him quietly packing a suitcase. He wasn't raging or making threats. He was simply folding his clothes, placing them neatly, as though he were preparing for a short trip. But how could I promise something I'd done so instinctively for so long? I felt torn between the desperate need to keep him in my life and the terrifying reality that I might not be able to change quickly enough. "I'll try," I said, my voice trembling. He nodded, stood up, and placed a hand gently on my shoulder. "I hope so," he said, and then he headed to the bedroom, leaving me with a sense of fragile possibility and a pit of anxiety in my gut. A flicker of hope ignited in my chest. "Then, do you think?" I stumbled over the questions that hung between us. He sighed, not in irritation, but in a quiet resignation. "I just need to be sure if we try again that it's real. I can't keep being the punchline every time you feel insecure." Tears pricked at my eyes, and I desperately wanted to assure him that I'd never do that again. He nodded, walked over, and sat down on the couch opposite me. The quiet was unbearable. I opened my mouth to apologize, but once again the words tangled up inside me. My eyes stung, and I bit my lip, determined not to cry. He watched me, waiting for what I had to say. Finally, I forced out, "I'm sorry." I could barely recognize my own voice. It sounded so shaky. He didn't respond immediately. He glanced at his hands, then back at me. "I know," he said softly. "I've known for a while." A part of me wanted to call him, beg him to come home, promise I'd never hurt him again. But I knew how hollow that would sound if I didn't mean it wholeheartedly. And I wasn't sure I was ready to unravel all my insecurities, all the petty reasons I'd found him embarrassing. There was fear at the core of it, I realized. Fear of being judged by others, fear of not fitting in, fear that I wasn't good enough, and that somehow, being with him reflected my own inadequacies. Admitting that would mean stripping myself down to a raw vulnerability, one I'd never dared show him, or anyone else for that matter. Late in the evening, I heard the front door. He walked in, paused when he saw me sitting there. I stood up, my heart pounding, and for a moment, we just looked at each other. He took a couple of steps forward, and I noticed how his expression held neither resentment nor longing, just a gentle sadness. "We need to talk," I managed to say. The weight of my choices pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. For the first time in weeks, I acknowledged that I'd been wrong. Not just in my choice of words that night, but in all the small, insidious ways I'd disrespected and undermined him over time. I'd never truly given him the chance to be himself without mocking or judging him. And now that he'd stopped trying, I was left with a silence that felt like slow torture. The thought that he might be happier without me was almost too painful to bear. But I realized I deserved that pain. Because if I'd cherished him even half as much as he once cherished me, none of this would be happening. I sat in our living room surrounded by the remnants of our shared life. Pictures of us on vacations, little trinkets from anniversaries, random souvenirs he'd collected, and realized I had absolutely no idea where to go from here. Eventually, the footsteps stopped. Whether he left again or stayed in the spare room, I wasn't sure. But I felt the finality in the air, the sense that we were existing on two separate planes now, occasionally intersecting but no longer truly meeting. Every memory I had of us, every shared joke, every inside secret, felt like a relic of a past life. I found myself trembling, wondering if he was content with this arrangement, if he was relieved to finally be free of my demands and criticisms. I sank onto the couch, feeling a heaviness in my chest like I'd swallowed a stone. For the first time, I faced the possibility that he might never come home for good, that I might have sabotaged us beyond repair. Later that night, I heard the front door open in the small hours before dawn. I didn't get up to greet him. Instead, I lay there, eyes wide open, listening to his footsteps moving around the house, quiet and purposeful, as though he was trying not to disturb me. I grabbed my phone and called him, hoping, dreading that he would pick up. He answered on the third ring. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice calm. "Where are you?" I demanded, trying to mask my desperation. "I'm out," he said simply. Silence stretched between us. "Are you coming home tonight?" I asked. He paused. "I'm not sure. Why?" And in that moment, I realized I had no right to ask. My words caught in my throat. "Never mind," I whispered, hanging up. But I realized that none of them really knew me, not like he did. They saw the image I wanted to project. Confident, fun, maybe a little sharp-tongued. But he'd known all my hidden insecurities, my silly dreams, the way I used to hum off key in the kitchen. And now, he was taking that knowledge and quietly stepping away, leaving me with an audience of strangers who would never truly see me. One evening, I couldn't stand the emptiness of the house anymore. It was as if he'd perfected the art of becoming invisible to me, ensuring no one else would see me in the context of our relationship anymore. I was living the exact scenario I'd cruelly joked about, not being seen with him. Only now, it hurt in ways I could never have imagined. I tried to keep myself busy to avoid drowning in guilt. I went out with my acquaintances more often, searching for a fleeting sense of comfort or validation. The moment passed, and I felt that chance slip away like water through my fingers. As the days blurred on, I became more conscious of how his presence was fading from my life, and not just emotionally. He started spending nights elsewhere, sometimes for work, sometimes just because he felt like it. He didn't always come home to sleep, And when I asked where he stayed, he just said, "With a friend," in a tone so neutral it gave me nothing to latch onto. He caught me staring and gave me a polite nod. I quickly looked away, feeling my cheeks burn with something that felt like shame. In that moment, I recognized how I was standing on a precipice. I could either swallow my pride, apologize, and try to rebuild what I'd destroyed, or I could keep living in this purgatory of half-spoken words and quiet regret. I opened my mouth, trying to will an apology into existence, but before I could speak, he stood up and carried his plate to the sink. And because he let me get away with so much, I assumed I could keep pushing his boundaries without consequence. Only now, the consequence was becoming painfully clear. One night, I looked at him across the dinner table. He was just finishing up a late meal he'd cooked for himself. And I was struck by how self-sufficient he seemed, how at ease in his own space. I realized I wanted to ask him about his day, to laugh at some silly thing he might say, but I couldn't. The words wouldn't come. And the question that began haunting me was, why had I never appreciated him until he was on the verge of disappearing from my life entirely? The thought unsettled me to the core. Maybe it was because I'd been so caught up in my own insecurities, worried about how I looked, how people perceived me, whether I fit into the right social circles, that I projected those fears onto him. He was the easy target, the partner who never fought back, the one who always tried to make me smile. In a moment of weakness, I scrolled back through old text messages on my phone, reading how affectionate he used to be, how many good mornings and silly jokes he would send. My replies were so lukewarm in comparison, I almost winced. Stop, I told myself. This self-pity doesn't help. But it wasn't exactly self-pity. It was more like a realization of how blind I'd been. And then I started noticing how different my life was without those small gestures now. The absence weighed on me in unexpected ways. I'd wake up, craving his warmth beside me, only to remember how we both slept on opposite ends of the bed, like strangers. I'd come home from grocery shopping, half expecting him to meet me at the door with some random bit of trivia he'd picked up that day, only to be greeted by empty space. I thought if I ignored them long enough, I could forget how to shape them altogether. That quiet confrontation opened a crack in my resolve. Over the next few days, I caught myself replaying old memories, scanning them for signs I might have missed. Times when he'd look at me with a quiet longing. Times when he'd try to hold my hand and I'd casually shrug him off. Times I'd brush his attempts at affection away because I deemed them too clingy or too public. He didn't. Finally, he just said, "I'm not the one who called you embarrassing." His voice was soft, almost gentle, and I felt the sting in my chest like a brand. Then he walked away again, leaving me alone with the awful truth that I was the architect of this entire downfall. I stood there, trembling, realizing that every time I tried to provoke him, I was really trying to provoke myself into admitting what I'd done. But the words, "I'm sorry," refused to form on my lips. But the words got stuck in my throat, because the conversation I needed to have was one where I admitted how wrong I was, how cruel those words were, how sorry I felt for hurting him. And I just couldn't say it. Not yet. So I ended up griping about the trash, the bills, the endless chores. He listened and nodded, offered to help. No fight, no drama. In a panic, I pushed harder, making snide comments about how he never tried hard enough to maintain our relationship, hoping he'd snap at me. I tried to fill my time with distractions, happy hours, weekend getaways with acquaintances, even mindless scrolling on my phone. But no matter how often I tried to escape it, there was this hollow pit in my chest, a constant reminder of what I'd done. And that's when I realized I wasn't just missing him. I was missing who I was when I was with him. Even if he embarrassed me sometimes, he also made me feel safe in the moments that mattered. Now that safety net was gone, and I was left with my own insecurities, fully exposed. One evening, I cornered him in the living room, determined to get a reaction. I told him how tired I was of living like strangers, how I wanted a chance to talk things through. He set aside his phone and looked up with an expression of genuine concern. "If you want to talk, I'm here," he said. One afternoon, I found myself staring at a photograph from our honeymoon, remembering how excited he'd been about every little thing, the beach, the local food, the long walks in the evening. I'd rolled my eyes at his enthusiasm, but secretly, I'd felt cherished, adored. Now I couldn't recall the last time he'd even looked at me with that kind of open affection. The week wore on. In some twisted way, I think I wanted him to lash out at me, to rage, to cry, to beg, to do something that would let me off the hook. Because if he got angry enough, at least I could label him the bad guy. But he didn't. He treated me like a polite roommate, and I realized how humiliating that was. More humiliating than any awkward social moment I'd blamed him for. And I realized, with growing dread, that the man I'd once taken for granted was teaching me exactly what it felt like to be left on my own. Silence soon became our normal state. Days turned into a haze of short interactions, mostly about bills or errands or trivial logistics. I felt his absence like a bruise, tender to the touch, reminding me of my guilt whenever I pressed on it. In the morning, he was gone before I woke up. The day passed in a blur of mundane tasks, yet all I could think about was how to fix this, if it even could be fixed. That night, I waited for him to come home, tried to make dinner, set the table, put on something nice. But he texted, "Don't wait up." No explanation, no apology, just a short statement of fact. When I finally mustered the courage to go into the bedroom, I found him lying on his side, eyes closed, face calm. I couldn't tell if he was asleep or just pretending. I stood there, thinking about crawling into bed beside him, slipping my arms around his waist, and whispering that I was sorry. But my pride wouldn't let me. Instead, I slid under the blankets, as far from him as I could manage, and stayed awake, staring at the wall until the darkness felt suffocating. I stood there alone in the living room, my heart pounding. Was that it? Was he just going to give up on us? Give up on me? A part of me felt furious at him for quitting so easily, but another part recognized that maybe I was the one who'd quit first. Only I'd done it in a single sentence. I'm embarrassed to be seen with him. That admission had severed something between us, and all my petty jabs and silent treatment had just dug the knife deeper. I just don't want to keep forcing myself where I'm not wanted. Hearing those words felt like a slap in the face. I wanted to argue, to tell him that I did want him around, just not so clingy or awkward. But the moment the thought crossed my mind, I realized how toxic it sounded. He studied me for a moment longer, then nodded to himself, as if he'd found the clarity he needed. He stood up, walked past me, and gently closed the bedroom door behind him. He just nodded, murmured a polite "hey," and went back to his screen. I exploded. Not literally, but emotionally. I started demanding answers. Why was he acting like I didn't exist? Why was he shutting me out? Why wasn't he angry at me for my comment? Didn't he care at all? He listened, letting me rant. And when I finally paused for breath, he set aside his laptop. He looked up at me, and there was this softness in his eyes that made my chest ache. "I do care," he said quietly. The role where he was always the awkward one. The one who'd fumble and apologize. The one who'd chase after me, seeking my approval. In that moment, he was none of those things. He was just a man standing a million miles away from me, even though we shared the same house. And it left me feeling hollow in a way that was worse than any embarrassment could ever be. Because I realized, maybe for the first time, that if he didn't care enough to fight with me, maybe he didn't care at all. I felt myself hitting a breaking point the following week. My anger and frustration had been building like a storm cloud, heavy with unspent tension. I came home late one night, half hoping he'd demand to know where I'd been. But again, there was no confrontation. He was sitting on the couch, reading something on his laptop, and he barely glanced my way. "I'm home," I announced, hovering by the entrance to the living room, waiting for him to react. I said things meant to rile him up, calling him boring, accusing him of being a doormat who never fought for himself. I even brought up past mistakes, throwing them in his face, hoping to spark some kind of reaction. He stood there, absorbing my words, but not letting them dent his composure. Finally, he just said, "I'm not trying to fight you, and walked away. That was the moment it truly sank in that he was done playing the role I'd set for him. He just looked at me calmly, as though considering how much to say. "I'm sorry you feel that way," he said, and that was it. No explanation, no attempt to shift blame, no anger, just a statement so measured that it infuriated me. I wanted him to slam his fist on the table, to shout, to do anything that showed he cared enough to push back. Instead, I was met with polite nothingness. And so, I did what I always do when I feel cornered. I lashed out. When I asked what he was looking at, he just gave me a small smile and said, "Nothing," before wandering off. The next day, I found myself checking his phone when he was in the shower. I knew it was wrong, but I had to see if he was talking to anyone, if there was another person filling the space I'd left vacant. There was nothing suspicious, just some brief texts with coworkers, a few unread messages, some memes. I felt a wave of relief, followed by an even stronger wave of shame, because now, I couldn't blame his distance on anyone else. This quiet drifting apart wasn't triggered by an affair or a hidden betrayal. It was triggered by me, by my words. Still, I refused to voice an apology. And as the days dragged on, my resentment toward his composure grew. One evening, I decided to confront him, not about the comment I'd made, but about his distance. "You've been acting really strange," I said, crossing my arms, trying to sound in control. Now it was happening, and the reality felt nothing like the fantasy. I was left with this deep ache, a sense that something essential was missing from my everyday life. I started noticing small changes that made my stomach twist. The way he'd come home at odd hours and not even bother to text. The way he seemed to have new routines, new places he went, none of which he shared with me. I caught him once standing in the kitchen late at night, gazing out the window with this peaceful expression. I kept thinking, in some corner of my mind, that eventually he would crack, that eventually he'd confront me. But he never did, and that only reinforced my feeling that maybe my words had indeed cut deeper than I imagined. I tried to push the thought away, but it lingered, leaving me restless and uncertain. I was starting to wonder if the fight I thought I wanted was just a way to keep him engaged, to keep him tethered to me, so I wouldn't have to face the idea that maybe he was strong enough to walk away. The strangest part of it all was that he never outright blamed me or hurled accusations. He simply let me be. I used to think that was what I wanted, a partner who wouldn't crowd me, who wouldn't make a scene in public, who would gracefully fade into the background if I needed him to. Night after night I lay in bed, an emptiness stretching between us even though our bodies were just inches apart. In that emptiness, a war played out in my mind. Half of me wanted to pull him close, to apologize, to say I didn't mean it. The other half was stubborn, insisting that if he wanted to fix things, he should be the one to make the first move. And so the nights went on, building a silent tension that was far more destructive than any argument could have been. So I began making little comments here and there, as if to provoke him. When I walked through the door, I'd say something like, "Oh, don't worry about me. I'm sure you're having plenty of fun on your own." If he noticed the sarcasm, he showed no sign of it. He just nodded, asked how my day was in a polite tone, and returned to whatever he was doing. It was maddening in its indifference. Instead, I spent more time out of the house, running errands, taking on extra hours at work, grabbing drinks with acquaintances I barely knew. I told myself I was living my life, focusing on the things that mattered to me. I tried to pretend I felt liberated, but every time I thought of how calm he looked when I wasn't around, I felt a flash of anger. I wanted him to miss me, to reach out, to ask where I'd been. He never did. Sometimes I saw the ghost of a smile on his lips when he was reading something on his phone, and I found myself wondering, with a twist of envy, what was making him so quietly happy. Was he talking to someone else? Was he planning something? The suspicion in me grew out of nowhere, and I recognized it as a sign of insecurity, but I refused to label it that way. Yet, in the quiet corners of my mind, I knew it wasn't just a one-time slip. The fact that I'd said it out loud, for him and others to hear, carried a cruelty I didn't want to face. So I doubled down on the narrative that he was being overly sensitive. I even voiced it to a friend when we met for coffee. He's practically giving me the silent treatment over a stupid remark. It's childish, honestly. My friend gave me a look that was half sympathy, half reproach. She asked me if I'd apologized. I shrugged. I shouldn't have to apologize for telling the truth, I said, even though a voice in my head kept asking why I felt so defensive if I believed that so strongly. Back at home, the distance between us continued to widen. He didn't bring up the comment again, nor did he seem interested in bridging the gap. In fact, he seemed oddly content, like a man who'd finally dropped a weight he'd been carrying. But there was a part of me that wondered, if I didn't take some action soon, would there ever be a way to fix this? I found myself spiraling into mental justifications. Of course, I told myself, I had every right to say what I did. He was a grown man, and if he couldn't handle a little honesty, well, that was on him. Besides, I wasn't saying he was worthless. I only said he embarrassed me sometimes. That's normal, right? We all get embarrassed by the people closest to us occasionally. And somewhere in that quiet tension, I began noticing the little ways I might have overlooked him all this time. It was a disconcerting feeling, especially when I realized I had no idea how to break the silence without admitting I'd messed up. I didn't want to give him that satisfaction yet, so I let the silence grow, all the while pretending I was fine with it. Not jealousy in the romantic sense, but jealousy that he was indifferent, that maybe he decided he didn't need me after all. And that's when a new thought surfaced. Had I always been the one who needed him more, but just couldn't admit it? I swept the idea aside. Of course not. I was the one who'd said I was embarrassed, right? I was the one who had the upper hand here. Or so I thought. The more he pulled away, the less sure I felt. But his breathing was steady, as if he was already asleep, and I hated that I felt unsettled while he seemed perfectly fine. I turned on my side, facing away from him, trying to dismiss the anxiety creeping through my mind. If he wants to be distant, that's his choice, I told myself. I shouldn't have to beg for his company. But the next day, when I saw how he barely looked up from his phone as I walked by, a strange pang of jealousy hit me. Maybe he'd gotten the message and was working on himself, or giving me time to breathe. But there was this tightness in my chest whenever I looked at him. I'd noticed the way his shoulders seemed less tense, like he was oddly at peace with this distance, and it made me feel resentful. Why was he so calm? Why wasn't he upset? One night in bed, I lay awake next to him, staring at the ceiling, waiting for him to say something, anything. I'd go to the kitchen, find a note, went to the store, in simple handwriting. When he came back, we'd exchange a few polite words. Dinner? Sure, whatever. and then the rest of the evening would drift away in near silence. Something was off, but I rationalized it. Maybe he was stressed. Maybe I'd actually hurt his feelings, or maybe he just needed space. I shrugged. If he needed space, then sure, take all the space you want. I'd told him I was embarrassed. And maybe it should have been a relief, right? Because that was the thing. He embarrassed me with his constant commentary, his random bursts of conversation, his unstoppable need to share everything he was thinking. And yet, for some reason, I started to miss it almost instantly. Instead of being annoyed by his presence, I found myself irritated by his absence. I'd come home from work, half expecting him to greet me at the door, and I'd be greeted only by the hush of the living room. No big argument, no explosive confrontation, just that he wasn't there in the ways he used to be. He was around physically, sure, sitting on the couch or working at the dining table, but he was absent in all the small, intimate ways I had taken for granted. He didn't ask me if I wanted coffee in the morning. He didn't peek his head into the shower to say hello, or crack some silly joke while I was brushing my teeth. He didn't fill the silence with his usual chatter. I just kept hoping for a fight, because I knew how to handle fights, yelling, tears, even ignoring each other for a day or two. But no. There was just this hush. And in that hush, my shame grew into something I couldn't define, but it made the house feel colder. It made me feel colder, and I had no idea how much deeper that chill could run until the days that followed. It might have been a Tuesday when I first noticed that something was different about him. I couldn't admit that part to myself yet. By the end of the day, when he still hadn't said anything, I wondered if I should apologize. But then my pride kicked in. Why should I? He was the one always making me uncomfortable in public. If he couldn't handle a little truth, then that was on him, not me. I decided to sleep on it, figuring we'd pick up the pieces in the morning. Of course, nothing changed the next morning either. That was the beginning of the wedge, though I didn't realize it yet. Why shouldn't I be honest about it? And yet, something about the way he looked at me that morning, like he was seeing me in a completely different light, made me wish I could rewind my entire life just a few hours. We went through that day in a tense quiet, but I convinced myself I was overthinking it. Surely he'd snap back to normal eventually. Surely he'd realize I didn't mean it. Or that if I did, well, maybe he'd try to be less embarrassing. I don't know. It seemed normal, but the silence between us spoke volumes. Deep down, I thought maybe he just hadn't taken it seriously. Or maybe he was giving me a chance to explain myself. But I told myself I had nothing to explain. It was a joke, right? I wasn't serious. And besides, there were times he embarrassed me. Showing up underdressed at events, talking too loudly, making silly jokes that never landed. I was always the one cleaning up his social mishaps, smoothing over awkward pauses. I laughed too, trying to reduce it to a joke, feeling this burning sensation in my chest as if I'd done something wrong, but not wanting to admit it. We went home that night, and I remember feeling uneasy, waiting for him to say something, to yell or argue, to call me out. He didn't. The next day, we woke up, and everything moved on in that typical, unremarkable routine. We had coffee. He asked if I wanted to order breakfast in. I nodded. I was with a friend. I can't even remember which one now because every detail that night seems hazy except the words that came out of my mouth. I'm honestly embarrassed to be seen with him. Not even a whisper. Not even hidden behind a playful smile. I said it out loud, more than once, letting the words dance in the air. My friend blinked. My husband. He barely flinched, but I saw something in his eyes that made my stomach tense. He laughed, a short, awkward sound like he was brushing it off. We were standing outside this small restaurant, some hole-in-the-wall place that had bad lighting and not enough parking. But I remember the night air felt thick on my skin. I remember thinking I looked good, wearing a new top I'd bought on a whim. He looked at me, smiling as though he was proud to be by my side, and God, I just said it.